Let's get started. So last Thursday, can everybody hear me okay? I don't want to blast it, but I want to make sure, okay, the volume's good. So last Thursday, Professor Thrailkill started our conversations about Regeneration, Pat Barker's novel, originally published in the early 90s. And for today, you are all supposed to read part 2, the second third of the novel. We continued some of those discussions last Friday during recitation, and we're going to continue those discussions today, looking specifically at war, trauma, and issues of masculinity in general, but also how they relate to Barker's novel, and hopefully how they relate to larger themes of the course as well. But before we get into Regeneration, I want to take a little bit of time just kind of foregrounding it in basic information about trauma in general. And at risk of being a bit cliche, we're actually going to start with kind of dictionary, looking at the OED, because the history of our understanding of trauma is really fascinating and ties into issues of gender and masculinity as well. So does anybody, again, it's okay if you don't know this, but does anybody want to give a guess as to where we get the word trauma or what it means? Anybody feeling brave? First question of the day. So that's okay. We've got a lot more productive questions. So trauma comes from the Greek for wound. So right off the bat, we have a sense of physicality of the body, particularly the body being ruptured or disrupted, an opening or a fracture. And if we look at the earliest usage of trauma, it again has that physical impact, right? It's a term that we still use today in regards to the body itself. Hospitals have trauma centers where people go into trauma medicine. A wound or external bodily injury in general, or the condition caused by this. So again, it comes from Blankert's physical dictionary. So again, that external wound. But a couple hundred years later, we get the version that we're going to be focusing more on today, and I think what we're more used to. With the rise of psychoanalysis or psychiatry, a psychic injury or psychological one, especially one caused by emotional shock, the memory of which is repressed and remains unhealed. An internal injury, especially to the brain, which may result in a behavioral disorder of organic origin. So what's interesting here is even in this second definition, we still have some connotation with the body, the possibility that it could be an actual physical injury to the brain causing deviant or aberrant behavior. But what does that mean for us? So in Regeneration, we meet a variety of characters who exhibit a variety of responses to traumatic experiences. So what are some of those, some of the ways in which trauma manifests itself in some of the characters? What do we see happening? Yeah, Will. Yeah, so we've got nightmares, right? That's a constant one. Rivers even calls it kind of like, this isn't the exact phrasing, but like the classic, symptom of war neurosis. What else do we see among the characters? Yeah. Yeah, so he's got, we can call it mutism, I guess, and then a variety of characters stutter or stammer, and they even have conversations about that, this struggle or inability to communicate. I saw a hand in the back. Yeah, Thomas. Yeah, being unable to eat, right? Burns is unable to keep any food down. So there's issues with consumption of food, with feeling just disgusted on a very visceral level and not even be able to keep it down. And his knees are even scabby from how much time he spent being sick. What else do we see? Yeah. Yeah, hallucinations, right? We've got hallucinations, flashbacks, waking nightmares. There's a long list. And these are not all the page numbers, but just kind of a brief list of what we see in the first 2/3 of the novel. So hallucinations, there's this weird sensory confusion, sleepwalking, mutism. There are issues with almost every kind of sense, right? Blindness, deafness, delusion. So if we think about Judith Herman in Trauma and Recovery gives a really useful introduction to the notion of trauma through one theory in particular, the idea that we all have a fight or flight reflex, this adaptive response to external stimuli in order to survive. But in certain cases, when the threat is too great, that fight or flight reflex is insufficient. So when neither resistance nor escape is possible, the human system of self-defense becomes overwhelmed and disorganized. Each component of the ordinary response to danger, having lost its utility, tends to persist in an altered and exaggerated state long after the actual danger is over. And what's important too is this in the second excerpt, she mentions profound and lasting changes in physiological arousal emotion, cognition, and memory with a variety of different manifestations. So one of the symptoms I didn't mention, but it's on here, is just this sense of hyperarousal, or always kind of being on edge, right? So you've experienced something that is so threatening, so overwhelming, that it lingers with you, and you're kind of constantly on edge. To the opposite degree, there can also be a level of dissociation and detachment and lack of affect as well. So in a way, it could be seen as kind of a distortion of the fight or flight reflex. And put into this context, I think a lot of these symptoms make sense. Either having sensory confusion, constantly being aroused, ready for danger, or constantly lacking affect. So again, there's just a few kind of key facts I want to make sure we cover in regards to trauma in general. Some are relatively obvious, but still worth articulating. So first of all, we've talked a lot thinking about scholars like Eric Cassell, the context-specific definition of suffering, right? So no single event can be defined as traumatic for all people. So we are all within a context of our own genetic predispositions, our past experiences, our current context, a variety of contexts. So we will all react to the same stimuli differently. There's a tendency to just say, that event's traumatic, or that person, there's no way that person wasn't traumatized by that. There's this assumption. We can definitely infer certain events are horrific. That event is probably traumatizing, right? But we want to steer clear of just kind of universalizing it, because again, in the same way that we react to pain or suffering or distress in different ways, or as Cassell says, one person's suffering may be a different person's, pain, but with a higher purpose, right? In a different context. In the same way, people react to a potentially traumatizing event in different ways. Secondly, psychological or psychic trauma often results from or coincides with physical trauma, but not always. It can happen without the presence of physical trauma. So again, if you're in a horrendous car accident and you're physically injured, at the same time, you could also be psychologically traumatized. Or you could have an injury that then leads to feeling traumatized. We've talked about the way one form of suffering or distress can cause another or exacerbate another. But it's not, this is a major turning point we'll get to in more detail. It's not vital. It's possible to be psychologically harmed without any physical harm. I was reading an article a couple weeks ago, the anniversary of 9/11, about a woman who was working in the World Trade Center, and she escaped completely unscathed, at least physically. And now, 18 years later, she eventually lost her family, she lost her kids, she lost her job, she's moved to another state. She's dealing with substance abuse and has several DUIs. And it's all because despite the fact that she was physically completely unharmed, she was traumatized by the event and never got over it. So again, you can appear to be unscathed, but still be traumatized. Trauma can be acute or cumulative. So again, in that instance, it was one moment that forever changed the trajectory of this person's life, but it can also be cumulative. Everybody do me a favor, take one hand and hold it out like this. All right, so if I put a 2-pound weight in that hand and you were holding it for a few minutes, that'd be no big deal. But after about 2 hours, that would really start to hurt, right? And the only difference is time. You can put your hands down. Thanks for being good sports. Time, right? The slow accumulation of stress or distress can slowly build up to a breaking point. It's 8 a.m., it's October, we're all hitting that October slump, right? You all look a lot more tired than you did on the first day of class, and that's natural, I probably do too. We all arrive at the beginning of the semester bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and this term's gonna be better, and I'm not gonna get behind. And I was just talking to somebody else, and he was like, yeah, October's kind of where it all falls apart. And I was like, yeah, it is. So eventually, some of us are saying, I just need to make it through till winter break so I can recuperate. Some of us are saying, I just need to make it to fall break so I can have some breathing room. Some of you are saying, I just need to make it through this lecture at 9:15, right? So again, trauma, the slow buildup of, on a weaker analogy, stress, right? But things can accumulate and slowly lead to a breaking point. It doesn't have to be one single moment. Obviously, the term is sometimes overused and thus diluted in meaning. We see this with other terms regarding mental health. Can anybody think of another example where like a similar term is overused? Yeah, right. After I saw Avengers Infinity War, I was so depressed, right? Like that's throwing around that term casually, diluting the meaning. Anybody think of another example? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, like what? Exactly, yeah, OCD, right? I have to take notes in blue, it's just my touch of OCD. I have to have the volume on even numbers, it's just my OCD. No, it's not. I mean, maybe some people are, but most people, when they're throwing around that term, it's not, right? These things have definitions in the DSM, right? So to use these terms casually is problematic and diffuses the meaning. And again, we can't universalize and say, like, there's no way you were traumatized by that. But odds are you were not honestly traumatized by the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones over the death of fictional characters. It's possible. I'm not going to say 100%, right? But for most people, it was probably just upsetting. And that casual use of the term is dangerous. So obviously, the term is sometimes doubted or misunderstood. Not all trauma stems from military experiences. There's other forms, a variety, obviously, gender-based violence, interpersonal violence. There are discussions of even ecological trauma, both in terms of the trauma we inflict on the planet and the trauma resulting from climate change. And then there's also this assumption that either all veterans are broken or traumatized, which again is universalizing an experience. Or on the opposite end, there's an assumption that no veterans are broken or traumatized because that's not the kind of people who join the military, or again, universalizing the experience and refusing to accept it. In general, one of the things we keep coming back to in this class is things are complicated, and it's usually not one or the other, it's a both and, it's a kind of a compromise, finding moderation. Okay, but let's take a step back. Let's think about the evolution of our understanding of trauma. So this is Jean-Martin Charcot. He's a French neurologist studying hysteria in the late 19th century in a former asylum in Paris. The name I'm going to butcher, but I'll try it anyway, Salpêtrière. Again, I don't know French. His protégés included Sigmund Freud, Pierre Janet, and William James, basically the founders of psychology. Charcot gave weekly public lectures providing live demonstrations of his patients and their symptoms. And again, he was studying hysteria, which at the time was considered this strange disease with these incomprehensible symptoms. It was specific to women and believed to originate in the uterus. They actually share the same etymological root. Think also of like hysterectomy. It was commonly associated with melancholia, but basically it was used as a catch-all for any female action that was deemed aberrant or deviant, basically anything that was beyond the realm of men's understanding or approval. It was also largely considered to be outside the realm of serious scientific inquiry, and Charcot actually he was pretty well renowned. He had a level of cultural authority, so it's interesting to think, we've been talking earlier about the rise of cultural authority among doctors, scientists. At this point, Charcot had enough to where his interest started to lend credibility to the study of hysteria. He approached his hysteria and his patients and their symptoms as a taxonomist. He had no interest in their inner lives. He was interested in just describing them and classifying them and putting them on display. And he believed that hysteria was a neurological disorder, that it was hereditary. Someone could get hysteria because they were predisposed to it. So if you had a breakdown, that meant you were a certain type of person, something that we'll see later on in Regeneration. But this notion got challenged with an interesting phenomenon called railway spine. And so this is where the evolution gets interesting because it brings in issues of mechanization and industrial machinery. So before the railroad, yes, there were disasters, there were catastrophes, there were accidents. But for whatever reason, I mean, think about the way in which the train is a technological paradigm shift. Suddenly we're transporting massive amounts of people at massive speeds across massive distances. If you have an accident in your carriage, it's a shame, somebody gets hurt, right? If you have a train derailment, there's gonna be massive numbers of casualties, injuries, and potentially death. So these marked one of the first early documented like mass accidents. And it's an example of that new industrial technology gone awry. So people would, fortunately, some of them would walk away from these accidents, apparently unharmed, with no physical injuries. But days or weeks or months later, they would report back pain or some kind of sensory or nervous system dysfunction. Now, some of these were just people with delayed onset of symptoms from a physical injury. That's why they say if you get in a car accident, doesn't matter how you feel, go get it checked out. But for many of these people, their symptoms could never be explained by physical injury. People complained of fatigue, headaches, difficulty in concentration, digestive problems, forgetfulness, stammering, reduction of sexual potency, cold sweat, states of anxiety, as well as vivid and disturbing dreams. So that list of symptoms, what does that sound like? Yeah, PTSD, right? The list of symptoms we were discussing in Regeneration. So at the time, though, and this is where it gets interesting too, because we bring in issues of economics and litigation as well. If you wanted to sue the railway company, you had to have injuries that were manifesting themselves physically, that were legitimate and had a physical explanation. So people were emotionally, physically, and economically invested in these disputes, trying to legitimize these mysterious injuries. So there was this widespread belief that the shock to one's system had to be a result of a physical shock to the spine, right? Some kind of stimulation or supposed deterioration of the spinal cord. And that mechanical shock caused by the accident is supposedly the explanation for these mysterious symptoms that take place. And so they coined the term railway spine. Again, the idea that if you're having physical symptoms, it has to have a physical cause. If you're suing us, you're either lying, you're crazy, or there is some physical cause. But over time, Charcot and his students realized that many of these people suffering railway spine were really experiencing what they were calling at the time hysteria and what we might now call PTSD. Again, up until this point, hysteria had been mostly associated with women. It had been acknowledged in some men, but only effeminate men, only degenerates, only deviant men. So again, already we have this association between trauma or hysteria with the feminine and with the non-male. But the people suffering railway spine posed a problem because they ran the whole gamut. They were a cross-section of the populace, all sorts of people, men and women from all different classes and backgrounds. And they were presenting symptoms of hysteria, or again, what we would now call PTSD. So Charcot maintained that you still had to inherit a predisposition towards it, but he eventually acknowledged that hysteria could be brought on by the trauma from events like an accident. So you still had to have that predisposition, but an environmental factor, a life-threatening situation, could suddenly catalyze that hysteria into action. Now, over time, the general beliefs evolved into a belief that the shock was a psychic shock rather than a physical one. And there was, they got rid of the idea of a microscopic deterioration of the spine. And so they realized it was coming from a psychic or psychological source rather than a physical one. And so eventually, railway spine became railway mind. Or immediately after that, traumatic neurosis. The first time the word traumatic appears in the English language, at least recorded, is in terms of traumatic neurosis, specifically in reference to these incidents. So again, at first, the source of hysteria is perceived to be purely internal, something that's already internally wired in you. But then with this new development, we see it as something that could be catalyzed by some external life-threatening event. And it doesn't have to create a physical wound, instead it could create a psychic one, manifesting through aberrant behavior or negative symptoms, and thus transforming the notion of trauma from something that's purely part of your psyche or part of your identity and physical, to something that could happen to anyone with a psychological connotation. And eventually his students even evolved beyond these beliefs. They thought, okay, if this injury is purely psychological, if the wound is psychic, then the solution needs to address the psyche as well instead of the body. And that kind of leads us into World War I and shell shock. All right, so we've got a few passages here. At one point, Sassoon is talking to Rivers, and Rivers makes a brief mention of the war, and we go straight to this. Immediately, he saw lines of men with gray, muttering faces, clambering up the ladders to face the guns. He blinked them away. At another point, Burns is traveling, and a branch rattled along the windows with a sound like machine gun fire, and he had to bite his lips to stop himself crying out. And then later in the reading, Rivers is trying to go to sleep. There's a storm, and he's thinking about his patients. All over the hospital, he knew men would be lying awake, listening to the rain and the wind, thinking of their battalions sinking deeper into the mud. Bad weather was bad for the nerves. Tomorrow would not be an easy day. So again, what's happening here? What are we seeing? There's a few different things. What symptoms are we seeing? You can just choose one, and not necessarily connecting all three. Yeah, Cherish.
We're seeing sensory.
Yeah, so there's sensory stimuli that are triggering these past memories. So past memories of past experience are intruding into the present. What else? You know, we could simplify that, or maybe this might be reductive of me, but we could refer to that almost just as flashbacks, right? Or what they sometimes refer to as waking nightmares. Suddenly with Burns, when he hears that branch rattle, he is hearing the machine guns going off. Or when the war is mentioned to Sassoon, for a moment, he is seeing that image, right? Again, the past has intruded on the present. So again, in an approach, you know, I mentioned earlier, Freud was one of Charcot's proteges, and Freud, among others, really emphasized the talking cure, right? The ability or the technique of encouraging people to remember and confront past traumatic events rather than struggle to repress them, right? Confronting them, reconstructing these events, perhaps trying to learn to live with them and to begin to control these events, reintegrating them into their lives. So we can see Rivers' treatment sometimes consisted of encouraging the patient to abandon his hopeless attempt to forget and advising him instead to spend some part of every day to remembering, neither brooding on the experience nor trying to pretend it had never happened. This makes me think back to Deborah Barrett and the dialectic between acceptance and change, right? So it's pointless and problematic to just try to repress these memories because you will never get rid of them. They will always be a part of your identity. But similarly, you don't want to brood with them, right? You don't want to just immerse yourself in these experiences nonstop because that's equally unhealthy. So instead, a lot of what we've been talking about all semester is about moderation, finding some kind of compromise or productive balance. It's not either or, it's kind of both and. And then we get to Pryor and Rivers. Pryor, they're talking about, again, the talking cure, basically. Pryor says, no, I don't think talking helps. It just churns things up and makes them seem more real. And Rivers responds, but they are real. It makes me think, I think I may have told this to my recitation, but a friend of mine has a kid who's like 1.5 years old. And he says, if she wakes me up in the middle of the night and says, I'm scared because there might be a monster under my bed, I don't tell her like, there's no monster under your bed, stupid, right? Like instead, no, there is no monster. That is not real, but her fear is real. The sensory or emotional experience is real. And in the same way, the intrusion of these past events, yes, they're not literally happening, but for this person, for Pryor, they are intruding on his life. These experiences are real. And talking is one way to try to confront it and gain control. But there's also a danger in this treatment, right? Rivers realizes in advising them to remember the traumatic events that had led to their being sent here, he was in effect inflicting pain and doing so in pursuit of a treatment that he knew to still be largely experimental. Brings us back to Cassell, the possibility that treatment can cause or exacerbate suffering. To ask people to confront these events and these memories is inherently dangerous, but still something that needs to be tried. But what are these experiences like? Does somebody want to volunteer to read this so I'm not reading all these passages to you? I'll bring the mic to somebody. A brave soul. I'll bring it to Cherish.
Thank you. Pryor, you blow this whistle, you climb the ladder, then you double through a gap in the wire, lie flat, wait for everybody else to get out. Those that are left, there's already quite a heavy toll, and then you stand up, and you start walking, not at the double. Normal walking speed, in a straight line across open country in broad daylight, towards a line of machine guns. Oh, and of course, you're being shelled all the way.
Great, thank you for reading that, giving my voice a quick break. Does somebody else want to read the much shorter passage? That's it. Making me walk, Katie, but I appreciate volunteering. You are being helpful.
Sassoon, what's an unnecessary risk, anyway? The maddest thing I ever did was done under orders.
Great, thank you. So, what do you see going on, especially in the top passage, or why did I pair these two passages together? Again, we're thinking about exploring what this actual experience is. We've talking about recovery, but it's worth actually viewing what is the original traumatic experience like. Yeah, Katie. Yeah, so there's a sense in which maybe it's normalized, maybe the sheer repetition of it, this becomes something that happens every day. Another way of interpreting kind of the way you're looking at it is it happens every day, which in and of itself adds to that cumulative stress, right? And of course, you're being shelled all the way. What about, look closely at the top passage. What strikes you about the style, the specifics of the text? Let's practice a little close reading. I know it's tough. It's 8:30. Yeah.
Towards the middle of it, you start walking, not at the double. You have this like very like start staccato-esque, and it kind of emphasizes like each sentence adds to the absurdity of it. Like you're walking, normal speed, across every country, and you're being shot at. Like it's just this like emphasis on how ridiculous it is.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So yeah, the style in the middle of the passage especially gets down to these short, not even complete sentences. It really emphasizes each new facet of what's going on. And you mentioned the absurdity. That's definitely something I want to get to. Yeah.
Also, like in the first section, it talked in context, like Friar's talking about how sexy it felt to be doing that, how I just think it kind of like in my mind like kind of seems like an unnecessary risk. Like, he's talking about like it kind of weirdly empowering it felt, and then talking about how unnecessary and like it's not needed that he felt that way, but the risk itself is there.
Yeah. So in a sense, the risk-seeking behavior is in some sense arousing or empowering, but also this sense of it is unnecessary, right? There's a sense of absurdity to it. Look at all these things we're doing. It's also presented in present tense. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point, and something that I wanted to point out was it seems to me like it's mocking Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est, and Wilfred Owen is actually a character in Regeneration, if I remember correctly. So I thought that was really interesting because, you know, the last line is like the old lie, Dulce et Decorum Est propter mori, like the old lie. It is like sweet and right to die for your country, and this is kind of, it's getting at kind of the glory of it, but then it inverts it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, so there's this subversion of the way we romanticize war. We have this, at least our characters, some of them may have an outmoded view of war. We'll get to that a little bit later. But yeah, where's the glory? We're stuck in a trench. And we're doing this almost mechanical routine of, all right, you climb out, you start walking, normal walking speed in a straight line, right? Adding to the absurdity. And then going back to an unnecessary risk, the top portion is something that Pryor and everyone else is doing under orders. So what's an unnecessary risk? The maddest thing I ever did was done under orders. These things, the nature of the war itself, is an entire unnecessary risk. There's a level of absurdity there. All right, a level of absurdity and a lack of agency. But I also want to think about Burns here, thinking about extending that idea of the absurdity of the war. Rivers is looking at Burns, thinking about him, and says, what had happened to him was so vile, so disgusting, that Rivers could find no redeeming feature. His suffering was without purpose or dignity. And yes, Rivers knew exactly what Burns meant when he said it was a joke, referring to the experience he went through, a very horrific one. If we kind of pair that with points from Sassoon's declaration, which opens the novel and thus frames it, a portion from that, I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. I believe that I may help to destroy the callous complacence which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not sufficient imagination to realize. So we've talked about, first of all, empathy, right? Or the difficulties in trying to imagine or understand someone else's experience. Sassoon's declaration definitely gets to that. But what do we see here? I'm curious, in your mind, Burns is presented as kind of an anomaly. His trauma, his experience is so strange, there is no dignity in it. There is no purpose in it. It's a joke. So he's presented as an anomaly, but I'm curious if you buy that, or if there's a different way we could read the function of Burns, at least so far. He's a completely fictional character. Any ideas there? Is maybe too leading of a question or not leading enough? Could there be a way in which he's not an anomaly? If this statement up top from Rivers could be applicable to people other than Burns? So I believe there is. So your challenge is to figure out how. We were just talking about the absurdity of war, right? The way in which we subvert the romantic expectations of the glorious war hero, often figured as a male. So yeah, Olivia.
Rivers is making the implicit suggestion that there is a certain type of suffering that has purpose and dignity, and maybe it would be not Burns's case, but maybe other soldiers' cases who didn't end up in the hospital. And so it's suggesting that like other people can deal with this if their situation is just a little bit different, if their trauma doesn't occur in such a strange or almost ironic way, because like that guy's in his mouth, right? Like the dead guy. But I mean, I really don't think, I feel like a lot of suffering is unnecessary.
Yeah, keep going with that. Again, it's just one way to read it. So first of all, you broke it down really well in terms of the language itself implies that there is a form of suffering that has purpose or dignity. But then what you just said, a lot of suffering doesn't. So how could we twist that? Not to put you on the spot. Anybody else want to help her out? All right, thank you for that. So Olivia finished by saying maybe a lot of suffering doesn't have dignity. I think it's possible to read Burns not as an anomaly, but almost as a stand-in. The language suggests there's purpose, there's suffering with dignity, especially in terms of the war. But it's also possible to take this statement and ask ourselves, thinking about this declaration in which the war no longer has just ends. So what are we fighting for? What's the point? What is the point of all of this suffering that these people are going through? Perhaps it's possible that in this context, at least, the entire war is a bunch of people having suffering so vile, so disgusting that there is no redeeming feature, right? That this is just merely a cruel joke. When faced with the horrors we see through the different characters' flashbacks, aren't all of their sufferings ultimately without purpose or dignity? One way to read it. So we can also think about acute moments of trauma and cumulative trauma. Pryor says, I cleaned up dozens of trenches. I don't see that would make me break down. Rivers responds, you're thinking of breakdown as a reaction to a single traumatic event, but it's not like that. It's more a matter of erosion, weeks and months of stress in a situation where you can't get away from it. So again, I think this is a perfect example, going back to what we touched on earlier, cumulative stress, cumulative trauma. Does anything strike you, especially in Rivers' response, about the style? How about the word erosion? What comes to mind when you think, what is erosion, literally? Yeah, Katie. Yeah, and I mean, I think the same way. I think it's definitely one way to read it is when I hear erosion in terms of trench warfare, it immediately makes me think of the fact that they're surrounded by dirt, right? Erosion is just dirt slowly being washed away because it's just particles, right? A mound or a hill is just a bunch of dirt particles packed together, and erosion happens because water slowly takes some of those particles away. So if in this metaphor, the person is being eroded, what does that suggest about personhood itself? You're losing a part of yourself, but what else? How would we tie that into the notion of what literally happens when something erodes? Yeah. Yeah, so physically breaking you down into pieces, the very metaphor kind of threatens the integrity of the body. We like to think that we are this whole piece that is constantly intact, right? To go back to Cassell, suffering is something that threatens our intactness. Yeah, Sam.
Something where it seems it's being continually eroded away and continually kind of degrading. It takes so much work to kind of counteract erosion and kind of build things back up. I think that kind of says the relationship between Rivers and his patients, just because whenever things erode, the outlook, or I guess just the way that things are shaped is vastly different. So it's almost unrecognizable at some sense. You kind of have to figure out how you can recognize yourself after.
Yeah, that's great. And I know I see more hands, but I want to make sure we have time to get to everything, so I apologize. But I love the volunteering. But to go back to what Sam said, making yourself unrecognizable, it's a constant, almost never-ending process and a constant struggle to fight against it. All right, so There's two other passages here, and my quiz here is why am I pairing these two together? So Pryor's describing another experience in combat, what you see every night, only I seem to be seeing it from the future. 100 years from now, they'll still be plowing up skulls, and I seem to be in that time and looking back. I think I saw our ghosts. And then another point, Rivers is kind of pondering these soldiers and says, in some ways, the experience of these young men paralleled the experiences of the very old. They looked back on intense memories and felt lonely because there was nobody left alive who'd been there. That habit of Siegfried's, Sassoon, of looking back, the inability to envisage any kind of future, seemed to be getting worse. So, we can talk about what you see in one of these passages, but I'm interested in why I'm pairing these two together. What kind of words do you see? What kind of signifiers or signals do you see in these two passages? Yeah, Cherish. That's interesting. That's the last part you said about it being a unifier or kind of transcending boundaries wasn't what I was thinking of, but I definitely think that's a valid reading. But what you started with was where I was struggling to lead y'all towards was simply temporality, right? Thinking of past and future. In both instances, it's kind of a withdrawal from the present. There's this dissociation from the present instead. And we can think about a few different things we have from some of our other readings. To go back to Herman, she's discussing the moment of trauma and the way it disrupts one's temporality. It is as if time stops at the moment of trauma. The traumatic moment becomes encoded in an abnormal form of memory which breaks spontaneously into consciousness, both as flashbacks during waking states and as traumatic nightmares during sleep. So this is thinking through kind of metaphorically, but also literally where do these flashbacks come from? What is happening with these nightmares? How is it that these past experiences continually intrude on one's present? We can start to combine this with Arthur Frank, who references Roy Schaefer's self-stories, right? Selves are perpetually recreated in stories. Stories do not simply describe the self, they are the self's medium of being. And to continue building off of Frank, he talks about the way in which we have expectations of a narrative, right? A past that leads into a present that sets in place a foreseeable future. Our story is wrecked because its present is not what the past was supposed to lead up to, and the future is scarcely thinkable. So again, everything I've done to get here, and then something happens, this wasn't what my past was supposed to lead to, and also how do I envision a future now that my intended trajectory is interrupted and altered. And then finally, we can tie it back to Cassell. Everyone has a perceived future. Intense unhappiness results from a loss of the future. Hope dwells in this dimension of existence, and great suffering attends the loss of hope. So tying these together, people form their identities with a verbal, and tend to form their identities with a verbal, linear narrative of their lives, right? We tell ourselves a story of who we are, who we've been, who we want to be. But illness, and then trauma, perhaps even more so, disrupts this trajectory, this story. It takes away our sense of past. It takes away our sense of hope in terms of the future. Traumatic memories themselves, they resist articulation. They resist being put into this psychological narration. And so they shatter your attempt to construct any kind of coherent vision of your history or your identity. Again, if we use Frank to think about the way we form our identity through stories, but then illness and then trauma especially interrupts, disrupts, even shatters that narrative, it challenges our very sense of self. So in reaction to this, trauma calls for testimony or witnessing in the same way that illness is a call for stories, right? You need to attempt to confront, discuss these memories to try to reintegrate them. But again, as we've said, trauma resists language, right? At one point, Rivers is talking to Pryor about his mutism. Mutism seems to spring from a conflict between wanting to say something and knowing that if you do say it, the consequences will be disastrous. And later on, when Pryor is kind of in hypnosis and kind of reliving this past memory, he talks about perhaps the origin of this mutism. A numbness had spread all over the half of his face. He ran his tongue along the edge of his teeth, curved it back, stroked the ridged palate, flexed his lips, felt the pull of skin and the stretching of muscles in his throat, all present and correct. But how they combined together to make sounds, he had no idea. So, again, these are about resisting language, right? Or even being something that is perhaps inexpressible, if we think about Elaine Scarry. In Scarry's work, she focuses mostly on physical pain in what we read, and actually talks about how psychological pain might have what she calls a referent. But still, I think we can think about the way in which this resists language, it resists articulation. And in both of these, there's kind of a fear of confronting reality, and thus a defense mechanism. Again, we've talked about empathy, we've talked about the challenges in understanding other people's experiences. And because trauma resists language, the talking cure and storytelling are potential agents for working through trauma. In a 2012 interview with The Guardian, Pat Barker talked about her motivation in writing Regeneration. She discussed her absent father and also her wounded grandfather. It was a bayonet wound, but he, Barker's grandfather, never talked about the war. So there was a wound and there was silence. But that kind of silence becomes compelling. It's a space which invites imaginative exploration. So again, I chose this passage because I was really struck by that phrase, there was a wound and there was silence, going back to the original definition of trauma and almost tying these two together, this sense of wounding and this resultant silence, this absence, this inability to articulate. She also talks about her choice in terms of perspective. I needed to write from the viewpoint of a character who was intelligent, compassionate, and well-informed, but who, like me, and like the reader, had no direct experience of the fighting in France. So in almost any text or film or movie, somebody is standing in for the audience, right? We're sitting on someone's shoulder or looking through someone's eyes. So who are we? Who is standing in for us? Who is carrying us throughout Regeneration? There's a mixture of perspectives, but there's definitely one main one that we're supposed to kind of identify with. I hear people muttering. Sassoon, maybe. I feel like, and again, I think this is up for debate, and there's definitely a mixture of perspectives, but especially if we look at her point here, right? She wants to look at from the perspective of someone like her, like most of the reading audience, has not had the direct experience of the fighting, right? Sassoon has had combat experience. I would argue, ultimately, we're seeing things, for the most part, or identifying mostly with Rivers. Again, there's a mixture of perspectives and areas of focus, which really makes it literally confusing sometimes, I think intentionally so. But ultimately, I think we're supposed to identify with Rivers, who's trying to empathize with, treat, understand these people who have had an experience that he can't quite comprehend. So our attempt as readers, sitting on his shoulder, we're trying to understand these characters as well. So our reading experience, in a sense, parallels his talking cure, his attempt to understand these characters. But this process, Barker's less concerned with depicting trauma than focusing on recovery, but this process contradicts social and military norms. So early on in the text, Rivers is concerned that another administrator is going to be upset that they're sheltering conscientious objectors, as well as cowards, shirkers, scrimshankers, which is an awesome word, and degenerates. Later on, when Pryor's father visits him, Pryor's father, when he leaves, said he'd get a damn sight more sympathy from me if he had a bullet up his arse. And then later on, Pryor's talking about breaking down and says, you see what I find so difficult is I don't think of myself as the kind of person who breaks down. And yet time and time again, I'm brought up hard against the fact that I did. So with these three pieces, we can see once again a priority of the body over the mind or the psyche. We can see the assumption that if you do break down, you're either faking, right? So our cowards, our scrimshankers, our shirkers, right? People who are malingering, right? Or that there's some kind of internal weakness. Going back even to Charcot, there's a certain type of person who breaks down when faced with this pressure, and certain type of people don't. You either rise up or you let it crush you. So there's this misguided assumption that if you break down, then there's something wrong with you. And that in turn exacerbates the suffering, right? So it's not just I'm traumatized, it's also because I'm traumatized, which doesn't fit the social norms I'm supposed to fit into, something's wrong with me, right? So there's that added level of shame exacerbating the suffering. Again, going back to Cassell, if something that threatens your intactness, your sense of self, that's suffering. And Pryor is already suffering, but then this self-loathing or self-doubt is just exacerbating that. And again, going back, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. You beat me to it by a minute or two. But yes, I did want to come back to that because I think there's a lot. It's a very short passage, but I would be curious. I want to see what can you take away from that middle passage. This is Pryor's father talking about Pryor. Yeah.
I think it just kind of supports the masculinity culture that's going on here, because Pryor's father is like, he comes and he says that he's almost disappointed that Pryor's in this mental institution. Instead, he wishes he was like, if there was going to be something wrong with him, he wished he'd gotten shot, or something physical wound instead of a mental wound.
Yeah, thank you. Let me bring it over to Cherish.
The thing that I find really interesting is the dad says the bullet up his arse, like around his butt. And when we think of that, there's not any like vital organ in that area. So like getting shot there wouldn't kill him. So the fact that he's saying that he would have more sympathy for him if he'd been shot there just goes to show how little sympathy he has for him in his current situation.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thomas, I'll come around to you. Yeah, so it's interesting, or actually, oh, you had your hand up, right?
I was just going to say, I think this kind of parallels something that we see even today, which is that a lot of people consider like psychological illnesses to be less important than physical illnesses. So something that they can see and they can actually like see the manifestation of tend to take precedent over mind games or, you know, just someone being weird.
Yeah, someone being so weak of nerves that they fell apart. Even perhaps, well, if he had a break, I'd understand if he had a breakdown, if he had a physical injury first. Yeah, Thomas.
Going off of what Chair said about getting shot in the butt, to have that happen to you, you'd have to be running away. So it's kind of arguing that he'd rather have him be a coward than like mentally ill.
Yeah, again, it's a strange choice, right? It's a place that would be kind of embarrassing, but also, yeah, would probably necessitate running away.
I feel like also getting shot in the butt is like, we kind of see that as like a joke. So it's like saying that carries more weight than being like having a mental illness. Like it's completely invalidating its existence at all. Like if that's a joke, then what does he think of like having a mental illness?
Yeah, again, who's seen Forrest Gump, right? At the one point, yeah, something bit me, right? Like the movie plays it off as a joke. I feel like, Todd, did you agree?
I just think that this passage, that this section's like really interesting because so illnesses, they basically call for narratives. We learned that earlier in the semester. And then earlier in this lecture, you said that trauma resists language. So I think putting those ideas together, it kind of shows the silencing effect that trauma has and some of the more like social, personal, I guess, problems that trauma can cause because of how silencing it is. You can kind of see some of like that deterioration in that father-son relationship.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Yeah, so the idea that one initial trauma can lead to... Did you read?
Oh, thanks. Maybe this is just me reading into it, but when I read this passage, I immediately thought of how, there's kind of a tradition, there's definitely a tradition in all kinds of forms of media of the sexual assault of men being played off for laughs and as a form of emasculation and victim blaming. And so that passage made me deeply, deeply like uncomfortable. But it also, like, if you look at all kinds of books and movies and popular media, like there's just that very like glaring tradition of, well, if you allowed this to happen to you in any kind of context, then that means you're less of a man.
Yeah, even the nature of blaming the victim. Let me check our time and where we're at real quick because I want to make sure we're still on track. So I do see more hands, but I want to make sure we're just getting into the masculinity thing. So I love the energy, but I want to go ahead and move forward. But we're going to keep kind of coming back to these similar concepts. So in a moment, and we're kind of already into this, in a moment I'm going to put a few words up on the screen. And what I want you to do is don't censor yourself, don't think, just immediately jot down whatever words or images or characters or people come to mind. Okay, so just the first thing that pops into your head. So what images, words, people, or characters come to mind when you see words like man, male, masculine? Surprise. So this might pay off or this might crash and burn. We'll see. Katie, were you going to share? Yeah.
Just like what we think.
Sure. Yeah, just what popped into your head.
It just makes me think of muscles.
Yeah, okay, so muscles, what else? I can share what popped into my head when I was writing this lecture. It's super embarrassing, and maybe that'll get some of you to open up. But yeah, muscles is definitely one, right? We think of strength, right? So the first three things, swear to God, that popped into my head. John McClane from Die Hard. I'm kind of dating myself and when I grew up. Rocky Balboa, of course, always wrapped in the American flag and battling communism. And then my dad, right? Which I think is pretty normal. We're trained to think of our fathers or older brothers or other paternal figures. But when I read myself in this, I say, okay, someone who's strong, someone who kills bad guys or fights bad guys, right? Muscles. Someone who's maybe kind of a smart ass, but not exactly an intellectual, and then just a paternal figure. So again, it doesn't have to be people, but those are just the first three things that popped into my head when I kind of tested myself. Katie said muscles. What else? We've got time for a couple more people to share. Yeah.
Yeah, first thing that came to my mind was soldiers.
Okay. Yeah, so soldiers, right? What else?
I thought of like Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec, like a real manly man who like likes meat and has a mustache.
I wish I had thought of that. Yeah, I saw another hand. Yeah.
I thought of rodeo and then timber.
Okay. All right, so I'm trying to keep track. We've got muscles, we've got soldiers, we've got rodeo or maybe cowboys, temper, Ron Swanson, right? The prototypical male, right? So there's a trend here. And again, it doesn't always work, but in general, I think what we're getting at is fairly obvious. We're conditioned to think of fathers or brothers, other paternal or older figures or models. We're conditioned to think about ideas of, what do we say, strength, of violence, of temper. That's really interesting. Again, and this, even the idea of muscles, the very first one, this priority of the mind over the body. No one said intellectual. No one said smart. No one said kind. No one said nurturing. All right, so we can get into, let's see. So again, we can look at this passage, which is pretty important, I think. Rivers, again, thinking about his treatment, thinking about masculinity. Does anybody want to read this so my voice isn't just shouting at all of you the whole time?
Rivers, in leading his patients to understand that breakdown was nothing to be ashamed of, that horror and fear were inevitable responses to the trauma of war and were better acknowledged than repressed, that feelings of tenderness for other men were natural and right, that tears were an acceptable and helpful part of grieving. He was setting himself against the whole tenor of their upbringing. They'd been trained to identify emotional repression as the essence of manliness. Men who broke down or cried or admitted to feeling fear were sissies, weaklings, failures, not men. In advising his young patients to abandon the attempt at repression and to let themselves feel the pity and terror their war experience inevitably evoked, he was excavating the ground he stood on.
Great, thank you. So I know that's a long passage just to have up there for everyone to stare at. And again, you'll have this PowerPoint to copy and paste these quotes from. But so what's going on here? How do we sum this up or translate it? We can sum this up in like a sentence or a phrase. Edley, I'll come back to you. I think we even talked about this the other day, right?
So basically it's Rivers trying to explain how his patients, you know, Sassoon and all of them, how he's encouraging them to have a different view of expressing through that talking cure how they should view manliness. And it's not about, he's encouraging them to basically show emotions and not repress them.
Yeah, thank you. So again, the idea that a psychological wound can affect anyone. It doesn't take a certain type of person, right? The fact that these men as men are first of all trained with conventions of masculinity that if we think about it, you know, we think about soldiers, we think about strength, we think about temper. At least men of this time are trained to, first of all, go into conflict that could be potentially traumatic. And then in terms of responding to it, not processing it. Instead, they're trained to repress it, to hold it in. It makes me think about Hemingway. When Hemingway's father died, He told the rest of his family, like, I don't want to see any tears. When he was bullied as a kid, he taught himself to whistle instead of crying, like real healthy. Like we know how that all turned out. So again, men are trained first to almost pursue potentially traumatic environments or situations, and then they're not taught how to deal with it. And then they're also taught, if you're actually affected by this, something's wrong with you. You're not a real man. You're deviant. Also, I want to point out the ending. He was excavating the ground he stood on. So once again, Rivers, when we're in Rivers' head, it seems like we're often thinking about dirt or erosion or digging, coming back to images of both psychoanalysis, digging into the mind. We can think about literary excavation, what we've been doing all day and what we do all semester, and also obviously trenches as well. So this kind of continues the same idea. The change he demanded of them, and by implication of himself, was not trivial. Fear, tenderness, these emotions were so despised they could be admitted into consciousness only at the cost of redefining what it meant to be a man. Not that Rivers' treatment involved any encouragement of weakness or effeminacy. His patients might be encouraged to acknowledge their fears, their horror of the war, but they were still expected to do their duty and return to France. So again, we're thinking there's this strange tension here that we're going to return to, but there's this tension between the desire to heal, but the job of your healing being done just so you can repair someone and send them back to the environment that broke them, right? I mean, imagine you're in a battle, you're traumatized, your doctor knows, like, you're terrified of trenches. Earlier, he's hearing a storm and he's thinking, all my patients right now are thinking about being stuck in the mud in these trenches. They're traumatized, they're horrified. My job is to talk to them for a while and say, all right, stamp for approval, go back to that trench, right? There's this really strange tension between the duty to heal, but in this context, the duty to repair the weapon of destruction so you can put it back out into the field. All right, so we can also think about the way quickly that war and trauma deal with relationships and gender roles, right? The meme at the top left is what reminded me of kind of Pryor's inability to sustain or create new relationships, right? Again, that level of dissociation or just disconnection from the present. But also thinking about just the way war in and of itself challenges or flips gender roles. When he's first thinking about Sarah, he says he didn't know what to make of her, but then he was out of touch with women. They seem to have changed so much during the war, to have expanded in all kinds of ways, whereas men over the same period had shrunk into a smaller and smaller space. At another point, Rivers is thinking one of the paradoxes of the war, one of the many, was that this most brutal of conflicts should set up a relationship between officers and men that was domestic, caring. And then I think one of the most powerful, they'd been mobilized, right? Mobilized, literally moving, sent to move into holes in the ground, so constricted they could hardly move. And the great adventure, the real life equivalent of all the adventure stories they devoured as boys, consisted of crouching in a dugout, waiting to be killed. The war that had promised so much in the way of manly activity has actually delivered feminine passivity, and on a scale that their mothers and sisters had scarcely known. No wonder they broke down. So this is touching on some material we talked about earlier. What do you see going on, especially in that bottom right passage, in terms of theme? Let me get out of your way so you can actually read it. What's going on with the great adventure, with these expectations? Yeah.
There's kind of an irony between the expectations of war and adventure versus the reality of it, and how, like, they're just sitting around waiting.
Yeah, right. There's a sense that this war is not like those glorious wars of the past. Maybe those glorious wars of the past weren't even so glorious either, right? So going back to this idea of the absurdity of war, subverting the way we romanticize it, subverting the way we even romanticize a certain form or convention of masculinity, right? There are no John McClanes out there. There are no Rocky Balboas out there. Or if they are, they have TBIs. Yeah.
Sure. I just wanted to say since I study women's history, but I also study masculinity, there's also a great and terrible irony that in these kind of horrible times when men are being completely broken, women are actually making like incredible gains on the domestic front and, you know, opening up into new industries that they never were basically barred from, both in the States and obviously in England, certainly more, you know, middle-class white women, but working women in general. But anyway, the point being, both during World War I and World War II, women made like huge gains and got more power and representations got better. You know, they weren't they started to like slough off the can only be housewife role. So it's a very kind of like sad antagonistic dynamic.
Yeah, thank you. It's sad that that dynamic exists, that the only way women could get that is when this other avenue is opened up through some other horrific event. Yeah. And there are other passages, but for the sake of time, we'll condense that portion in which gender and gender roles get flipped. I do want to think about something else. I want to think about military training, right? The way in which we take an ordinary person and turn them into a tool for killing. There's a certain type of training that has to happen that requires a kind of form of mental distancing. So what other kind of training could we correspond with military training? Let's see, who have we not?
Well, I guess like the mental distancing part, like, yeah, doctors are taught to be empathetic and caring and compassionate with them, but with their patients, but they also have to like mentally and emotionally distance themselves, because if you have patient after patient that has cancer and going through chemotherapy and like that affects you as if you were their family member, like you're not going to be able to handle that for very long.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. I thought it might be a little harder and wouldn't get it on the first try, but yeah, the medical training, right? They're both being trained for an intense experience or interaction with the body, right? And training that tends to usually prioritize the body over the mind. There's this need to create some kind of emotional distancing, some kind of hardening, and we can discuss the trade-offs, right? We definitely value the empathy, but there is a certain necessity among medical practitioners to create some sort of distancing for the patient's benefit and for their own. And in the same way, there's a mental distancing that happens for soldiers. There are questions about how we train people to deal with that, and I think there are differences in how they're trained to deal with that, but both are having these intense experiences opening up the body. Is there much difference between a World War I soldier with a bayonet and at the beginning of Begin Cutting, right? When someone's holding a scalpel over a body. One difference is that the body is already dead, but they're both very intense experiences. So I want to jump to two super quick video clips here. The first is from Patch Adams, which is a very cheesy movie, and it's a little outdated, and this scene takes place decades ago, so the view of medicine is a bit outdated, but I still think it's worth taking a look at.
First, do no harm. What is implicit in this simple precept of medicine? An awesome power. The power to do harm. Who gives you this power? The patient. A patient will come to you at his moment of greatest dread, hand you a knife and say, "Doctor, cut me open." Why? Because he trusts you. He trusts you the way a child trusts. He trusts you to do no harm. Sad fact is, human beings are not worthy of trust. It is human nature to lie, take shortcuts, lose your nerve, get tired, make mistakes. No rational patient would put his trust in a human being, and we're not going to let him. It is our mission here to rigorously and ruthlessly train the humanity out of you and make you into something better. We're going to make doctors out of you.
So there's a slightly later scene where the main character, Patch Adams, actually mocks that speech in the tone of a drill sergeant, which came to mind when I thought of this analogy, but I couldn't find that point. Now, I want to contrast or compare that with a quick discussion. We're just going to watch like 2 minutes of this, of military training.
So the Army simply reinforces something that we were taught a long time ago. That's simply that men don't cry. When a little girl falls down and hurts her knee, we go into the high voice. "Oh, my baby all right? Let me kiss that boo-boo. Oh, can I put a Band-Aid on that owie?" But when a little boy falls, the message is very different. We say things like, get up and stop crying, because boys don't cry. Or worse yet, we say things like, get up and stop crying before I give you something to cry about. And so the military has endless versions of this. Endless versions. Suck it up. Drink water. Drive on. There are even people, when we lose a loved one, who would tell us to pull it together so that we can be strong for somebody else. A few days ago, I saw a shirt that read, "To err is human, to forgive divine, neither of which is Marine Corps policy." As one drill sergeant put it, I can't teach two things at the same time. Either I'm teaching you to be hard, or I am teaching you to be soft. And we ain't trying to create no soft army. And so the lesson that we learn is that soldiers don't know when they can begin to talk about their problems.
Okay, so again, we can think about these issues. I can't teach two things at the same time, right? We can think about this in terms of medical training as well. How do we balance, again, returning to that idea of balance, compromise, how do we balance the need for some kind of distancing with the acknowledgement that both medical professionals and soldiers are human beings as well? All right, to wrap things up quickly, we're not going to look at this entire passage, but I want to think also about the idea of being fit for duty. This returns to the notion of sending someone back, healing them just so you can put them back into the line of fire. Rivers is thinking about the medical boards, where the medical officers have to decide if people decide which men were fit to return to duty. This would have been easier if he could have believed that men who broke down were degenerates, whose weakness would have caused them to break down eventually, even in civilian life. But Rivers could see no evidence of that. The vast majority of his patients had no record of any mental trouble. And as soon as you accepted that the man's breakdown was a consequence of his war experience rather than of his own innate weakness, then inevitably the war became the issue. And the therapy was a test, not only of the genuineness of the individual's symptoms, but also of the validity of the demands the war was making on him. So again, even in the very notion of fit to serve, fit for duty, I think of literally fitting something, right? Conforming, shaping something, constructing something. We use this to define what is healthy or not healthy, what is acceptable or deviant behavior, to define real men versus sissies and scrimshankers or degenerates, supposedly healing someone again just to send them back into combat. And again, it's easier to blame the men than to blame societal structures. Whereas in general, it's easier to blame the individuals in any circumstance than the societal structures. So no, these people are breaking down because they would have eventually in any circumstance, right? That's much easier to accept than maybe war is so horrible that everyone will eventually break down. Maybe there's a problem as the novel begins right off the bat with Sassoon's declaration that this war, this suffering can no longer be justified. So I just want to leave you all with some questions that maybe we can continue to think about moving forward into tomorrow's recitations or in preparation as well for Tuesday's lecture, where we'll have, I believe, our last day discussing regeneration. And I'll frame it reminding us of this quote from Rivers: his patients might be encouraged to acknowledge their fears, their horror of the war, but they were still expected to do their duty and return to France. So in the context of modern warfare, can shattering experiences be reconciled with conventional social roles? Conventional social roles regarding gender and domestic relationships. We could think this in terms of class in a variety of ways, right? How do you maintain who you are? How do you reintegrate into society? How do you just maintain your sense of self if these experiences shatter your life and that sense of identity? What is the responsibility of the physician, one who is charged with alleviating suffering, to cure men of their horror, grief, and rage in order to send them back to fight? Again, going back to that quote at the top, how do we deal with that tension? What are the trade-offs in medical and military training? Is there a more productive approach or solution? Maybe there isn't, not a practical one. Maybe there is. Maybe it's something about finding balance. And then a very general question that I just want to leave you with as you continue moving forward, because I know you guys don't have anything else to do. How do the various issues we see in regeneration continue to apply today and or relate to other larger themes of this course, maybe themes that we haven't gotten to yet in our lectures or recitations? So challenge yourself to identify some new things that we haven't addressed yet.
Hey guys, I think Paul's given us amazing food for thought. With respect to the last question, I don't know if any of you noticed, but in the clip from Patch Adams, did you see the camera home in on two actors? Robin Williams, Philip Seymour Hoffman. Where are those men today? They're both dead. And they both had addiction problems, right? So, I mean, I think that this last question is a really important one for us. And to tie it all back to the way Paul started class, it's October. It's a really hard time in the lives of you and your friends. So I think we have to think about the last question a lot. See you next week.
Yeah, take care of yourselves as well. Maintain self-care. That's my closing message.